What I want to do today is share with you a way in which we can double world GDP, a way in which we can completely end abject poverty, and a way in which we can create a more free and just world. The economics of doubling world GDP is actually pretty simple. Suppose that we take a worker in a country such as Haiti, Ghana, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Guatemala. How much of these workers earn? They're typically earning less than $5,000 in a year, sometimes much less than $5,000. In Haiti, they might be earning $2,500 for a year's worth of backbreaking labor. Now, suppose that we take one of these workers and we move them to a developed country, such as the United States. What happens to their earnings? Their earnings skyrocket, doubling, tripling, sometimes increasing by as much as 10 times. Indeed, over a wide range of developing countries, on average, moving a worker from where their labor has low value to where their labor has high value increases GDP, increases their earnings by 5 times. There is no other anti-poverty program that you have ever heard of which has anything like this effectiveness at alleviating poverty. Not microcredit, not investments in education, not even in eliminating all tariffs on goods and services. Indeed, if the developed world were simply to allow their labor force to expand by 1% drawn from the developing world, that would be worth more than all of the world's official foreign aid combined. So clearly, immigration is great for the immigrants. What about for us? What about for the residents of the developed world? Well, immigration is great for the immigrants, and it is good for us as well. There are, in fact, many, many jobs in the developed world which immigrants are willing and able and capable of doing. Take a look at this. This is what I call an economic absurdity. Here we have invested millions of dollars in scanners and satellites and computer equipment so that people self-check out. While at the same time, there are millions of workers in the developed world who are willing and able to do these jobs, who are capable of doing these jobs, who would like to do these jobs. Indeed, there are thousands of workers in the developing world who are dying to do these jobs. This picture was taken just a few weeks ago. Shows a migrant from Africa washed up on the shores of a Spanish island, come in search of a better life, a life of economic opportunity. This is not an economic absurdity, it is a moral abomination. And it is not necessary. It is not necessary because the residents and the migrants have much to gain. The best way of thinking about immigration is as trade. Residents and migrants have different sets of skills. And by allowing peaceful, voluntary trade, both the residents and the migrants can specialize, can do what they do best, and in this way increase the total size of the economic pie. The way I like to put it is this. The migrant who mows the lawn of the nuclear physicist, that migrant is indirectly helping to unlock the secrets of the universe. Now, perhaps you're asking, what about the developing countries? Don't they need to get their act in order? Isn't that part of the story? And indeed it is. So one of the reasons why the developing countries are poor is that they have not yet fully adopted all of the institutions which have made the developed world rich. Institutions like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, private property, the rule of law, capitalism. These institutions are an important part of the story, but they are not the entire story. They are not the whole story. Because there are simply some places in the world which are not well suited to mass economic activity. You can take the best institutions in the world, and if you bring them to the African Sahel, to the landlocked, drought-ridden region of the world, you are not going to make that part of the world Hong Kong. And if you happen to be unfortunate enough to have been born in that part of the world, your chances of achieving a high standard of living, a Western standard of living, are incredibly small simply because of that misfortune. There are simply some parts of the world which are not well suited to mass economic activity. If you doubt this, take a look at the United States. The United States has good institutions pretty much across the board. But economic activity is concentrated. It's concentrated in a handful of regions, typically metros along the coasts, along navigable rivers, on the Great Lakes, and so forth. Half of US GDP is produced in these orange areas. And in much of this blue area, there's actually been a decline in population in the 20th century. That's okay. As the jobs left, people left as well, moving to economic opportunity. But what would have happened if the jobs had left, but the people had been cemented in place? I want you now to think about an alternative history of the United States, just slightly different from our own. I want you to imagine that the Louisiana Purchase had fallen through. I want you to imagine that Texas had remained an independent country. I want you to imagine that California had gone its own way. And that each of these now independent countries had established walls against the rest, just as we have established walls against the rest of the world. I put it to you that we might now, had this happened, we might now be talking about the French Louisiana problem. Why are these so poor in greater French Louisiana? Is it their civil law legal system? Is it the culture? Is it the laissez-le-bon temps rouler problem? They just like to party. They don't have the same work ethic as the New Englanders. Is that the problem? I put it to you instead, the answer would have been that we locked people in to a place which was not well suited to mass economic activity. Now take a look at this. In the actual history of the United States, the history with open borders, it's clear that the United States, because of its history of internal open borders, was richer, was freer, and was more just than the alternative history. There's also an alternative history of the world in which we have greater open borders. Is that naive? I don't think so. Take a look at this. This is from an 1868 treaty between China and the United States, an actual treaty establishing open borders. And in that treaty it reads, "We recognize the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance." The inherent and inalienable right. We have to think about immigration as not just an economic issue, but also a moral issue. We have to ask ourselves, when is coercion justified? Is it justified to prevent a murder? Of course. To prevent a rape? Certainly. Is coercion justified to prevent two people from making a mutually profitable exchange, a voluntary, peaceful exchange, especially when such an exchange would be perfectly legal when made between two citizens? Is coercion justified? Is it justified to use walls and machine guns and barbed wire to prevent two people from making a peaceful, voluntary exchange just because one of them was born elsewhere? I don't think so. You know, today, we treat states which don't allow their people to leave as pariah states. I believe in the future we will treat states which don't allow people to enter as also being pariah states. You know, today we live in a world of global apartheid. And yet, I'm actually optimistic. I'm optimistic because our greatest moral failing, the system of global apartheid under which we live, is also our greatest economic opportunity. So I'm optimistic because when I look around the world, I see a greater openness. Openness to ideas traveling around the world, to capital moving around the world. Capital moves around the world at lightning speed, and yet labor is chained to where it was born. This is a situation which cannot last, and I believe which will not last. We live in a globalized world, and I see a world in which people are free and equal to move about in search of economic opportunity, in search of a better life. People are free to exercise their right to vote with their feet. So, how do we double world GDP? How do we end abject poverty? How do we create a more free and just world? I'm going to conclude where I began. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.